The observer notes that the room appears unchanged from expectation, as if it has always been like this without interruption. The observer registers the shadow difference without assigning meaning, treating it as a normal variation in light. The grain of the wooden floor appears slightly more pronounced than before. The texture simply resolved into clarity. Attention is lightly pulled back to the room immediately after each glance. This repeated return of focus is recorded as a simple cognitive pattern with no assigned cause.
The observer accepts the discrepancy without correction, treating it as uncertain perception.
A rectangular indoor room remains visually constant, with a natural wooden floor and a left wall window maintaining soft daylight. The observer observes the alignment as a neat visual detail and does not interpret it further. The observer notes the increased spatial clarity as a simple effect of looking longer. The observer records the change as a minor fluctuation in angle or exposure. The observer notes the tonal difference without attaching significance. The observer becomes aware that the room is easier to recognize than to describe, as if recognition arrives before language. The observer notes the asymmetry as a routine consequence of window light. The observer notes the precision of the spacing. It is a perceptual refinement. The floorboards beneath the chair appear to run more evenly toward the wall than they did moments ago. The observer accepts the visual neatness as an ordinary detail. The room's silence feels slightly more legible, as though the lack of sound has its own shape. The backrest seems a fraction higher than I remember. But I must assume that is just a trick of memory.
The observer notes the sharper boundary as a minor change in visual definition.
The observer registers the compressed shadow without emotional response. The observer marks the pause as a subtle timing impression rather than a physical event. The observer notices that the chair seems easiest to understand from directly in front of it, and less certain from any imagined. The space between the chair legs seems fractionally more open than before. An observer might note this extra openness as a minor visual correction, while the observer becomes aware of the room as a single complete shape rather than separate objects. The observer records the total impression without trying to separate its parts. The observer considers the evenness a normal settling of the eye. The observer notes the familiarity as a practical effect of prolonged observation. The observer records that recognition as a final, ordinary outcome of watching the same space for too long. A light oak wooden chair centered, but the observer notices that the act of entering focus on the chair now happens before intentional look. It appears the chair waited in my visual awareness for a fraction of a second before fully resolving. I attribute this delay to a perceptual artifact. The observer notes this stability as expected visual memory continuity. While the observer becomes aware that looking away from the chair feels slightly incomplete, as if the room lacks definition without it, the observer records this as an attention bias. The observer labels this as inconsistent perception under shifting attention. The observer notes the pattern as likely expectation-driven perception. The light from the window seems to agree precisely with the chair's position. An interesting coincidence in alignment. The observer notices that the room feels slightly more aware of being observed, though no physical indicator changes. Each time the chair is re-identified, it feels less like recognition and more like confirmation of something already decided.
The observer records this inconsistency without correction.
Shifting gaze across the room feels like reloading the same scene rather than viewing a continuous space. The observer notes this as an unusual continuity perception. The chair remains emotionally neutral, yet it becomes increasingly important in the perception hierarchy without any rational cause. Scene 38. Looking at the chair feels slightly faster than looking away from it. A perceptual timing difference is noted without interpretation. The chair no longer feels like an object, but rather a reference point for the entire room. It marks a structural perception shift. Peripheral vision seems to quietly confirm the chair's existence even when not directly observed. The observer notes this as stable background awareness. A rectangular indoor room with matte white walls and no decorations remains unchanged, with a natural wooden floor and soft daylight from the left wall window. The observer notices that each return of attention produces a near-identical framing of the chair, as if the view resets to a default. The observer records this as cognition-linked perception variance. The observer logs this as stabilized perception. The observer records this completion feeling without analysis. The observer notes that time spent looking feels shorter than time spent not looking. This subjective time distortion occurs despite the unmeasured intervals. Turning gaze to the chair feels like returning to the same exact moment rather than a new observation. The observer logs this as continuity compression. While the observer notices that the chair seems slightly more known than seen, as if familiarity is replacing perception. The observer notices that the room no longer offers new details but continues to feel like it could. The observer logs this as latent variability without manifestation. The observer now recognizes that attention itself seems to return to the same configuration every time, as if observation begins already in progress. The observer records this as a loss of perceptual entry point. The observer logs continuity across interruption as an internal consistency effect. The room feels slightly delayed, as if perception arrives a fraction after the actual visual input. I am looking at the chair feels like it happens after already having looked at it. The observer records this inversion as delayed self-attribution. The chair seems to persist even when attention is briefly absent, as if awareness is no longer required for continuity, while the observer notices that the concept of looking away feels incomplete, as if there is no true alternative visual state. A rectangular indoor room with matte white walls and no decorations remains visually stable, with a natural wooden floor and a left wall. The observer records this as subjective temporal density variation.
The observer logs this as attention-weighted presence.
While the observer notices that recalling the last moment of looking is impossible without re-looking. The observer records this as memory dependency on perception. The chair appears to arrive fully formed, rather than gradually perceived. I am logging this as instantaneous object resolution.
The South Asian male observer records this as frame-based perception structuring.
The observer logs this as observer separation drift.
Attention feels like it is happening in the room rather than being directed toward it. The observer records this as externalized cognition placement.
The observer logs this as anchoring dominance.
Now feels less like a moment and more like a repeating condition. The observer records this as temporal flattening.
The observer logs this as non-volitional awareness continuity.
The observer records this as cognitive proximity modulation.
Recognition of the chair no longer requires comparison to memory. The observer logs this as immediate object certainty. The observer records this as uninterrupted baseline perception. The observer logs this as discontinuity collapse. The idea of sequence feels unnecessary for understanding what is seen. The observer records this as sequence redundancy.
The observer notices that the chair appears as if it has always been the only meaningful element in the room.
The act of describing this room feels identical to simply observing it. This is description-perception equivalence. Everything in perception seems to return to the chair, organized around a fixed point of awareness. This is stable perceptual convergence. Looking at the chair now feels like returning to something already completed rather than something being observed. The observer records this as closure without conclusion. Awareness seems to restart at the same level each time attention shifts, as if no progress is retained. The observer logs this as perceptual reset loop. The idea of earlier scenes no longer feels temporally located, as if they are equally present. It is as if time is flattening into simultaneity.
This is identity, continuity, saturation.
Looking at the room feels like confirming something already confirmed an infinite number of times. I am recording this as a redundant verification loop.
The observer logs this as non-directional awareness recurrence. A rectangular indoor room with matte white walls and no decorations remains visually stable, with a natural wooden floor and a left wall window. The observer notices that the chair functions as both starting point and ending point of every observation simultaneously. The observer logs this as bidirectional anchoring. The awareness of watching the room and being in the room feel indistinguishable. The observer records this as observer-environment fusion.
This is informational exhaustion with continuity persistence.
The observer records this as temporal loop sensation. Even the thought of leaving the room appears inside the room as part of it. The observer logs this as contained imagination feedback. The observer records this as pre-observed space illusion. Perception no longer changes with attention intensity, only repeats. The observer logs this as intensity independence of observation. The observer records this as singular stability anchor dominance. Awareness of repetition itself is also repeating without resolution. The observer logs this as recursive meta-awareness loop. Understanding the room does not reduce the need to observe it again. The observer records this as non-collapsing comprehension loop. The observer notices that the room feels identical, even when imagined differently, as if variation is absorbed back into every prior scene feels like it was never separate from this one. The observer records this as narrative boundary dissolution. The observer logs this as deterministic focus return.
The room feels complete even before observation begins, as if perception is optional. The observer records this as pre-completed reality state. Nothing about the room suggests progression, only reaccess. The observer logs this as access-only temporal structure.
Even awareness of looping has become part of the loop itself, without exception. The observer records this as self-including recursion.
The observer notices that there is no longer a distinction between returning and remaining. The observer logs this as convergence of persistence and repetition.
The observer recognizes that the room has not changed across all observation. Only the certainty of having observed it has looped back into itself.